You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast, and good morning, everybody. It is Saturday, April 5th, Final Four week, and as the college basketball season coming to a close, women's Final Four already took place, and what a shock. It's going to be South Carolina and UConn. Who would have thought? Men's Final Four tonight, if you're listening to this Saturday morning or afternoon, or yesterday, I guess, if you're listening to it Sunday. But should be some interesting games. You hope with a Final Four that's got all one seeds that we've saved the actual good games for this weekend. We'll see if it actually happens. I have my doubts. But it is sad that the actual playing portion of the college basketball season is this close to an end. You're on this roller coaster with college basketball that lasts for months. And especially the last month and a half, it's like right in your face. You're right there. You're watching all the games, and then it's just over. And we are getting rapidly close to that. Of course, the portal season, still very active. We're going to talk about that as it relates to Indiana. We're going to talk about some economic realities as Dr. GC will be getting class into session here for a little bit, talk a little bit about some of the things we're seeing in the transfer portal and how it relates to some other forms of player movement elsewhere, and why and how to start thinking about it in a different way from how we have traditionally thought about college athletics, or even, frankly, how we think about some of the player movement that happens in professional sports here in the United States. So we're going to talk about that here shortly. First of all, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and they are just all over the place. We keep talking about this. You heard it on the last podcast that Scott and Ryan did. You see home field from New York to California, everywhere in between. You see a ton of it here in the state of Indiana. I've got my Let's Shock the World Fairleigh Dickinson shirt on this morning, and you can outfit yourself in all kinds of amazing things from Home Field Apparel. Just hit up the code HOME23 on their website and get 15% off your first order. That lets them know that we sent you. Again, HOME23. If you haven't shopped there before, what are you waiting for? Great reward system, too. I'm always amazed at how quickly I build up points when I order from Home Field, and that means I get prices off of future purchases. Sometimes it's $10, $50. I mean, it just depends on how much you're building up, but they do give back on that front. So there's rewards for creating an account and being in the ecosystem. So head over to homefieldapparel.com and let them know we sent you here from the Back Home Network. Speaking of the Back Home Network, we want to get you on the YouTube channel. If you're not watching the podcasts, well, you're kind of missing out. And we've got over 7,500 people now that have subscribed to the Back Home Network YouTube channel. I will put it in the Substack as a link if you want to go and just do a direct subscription. It's free, and it allows you to get a notification on YouTube whenever we launch a show, which sometimes is live shows, sometimes it's pre-recorded things. But it's a great way to follow along with the Back Home Network and not have to deal with all of the things you deal with on other social networks. We also are on Substack. Like I said, if you go to crimsoncast.substack.com, you can subscribe there. It's free as well. And you can get episodes and links delivered right to your inbox. I'll have a couple of links associated with this podcast. You want some extra reading material, get a chance to dive a little deeper into what we're talking about here on the show. It's a great way to do that. And there's also an option for a slight amount of money to help support the podcast, $5 a month, $50 a year. You don't have to do it, but we always appreciate the financial support. Again, crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you in that community as well. All right, let's get going by talking about some of the things going on out there in the world of college basketball as it relates to IU. So here's what we got right now. Not a whole lot. Connor Enright, welcome to Bloomington. Obviously, Tucker DeVries going to be here as well. It's been slow, and that has caused some concern amongst the people. And I wanted to just echo some of the what I would consider insider sources and some of the observers in saying this is not something to be overly concerned about yet. It is only April 5th. And, we talked earlier on in the process of when all this was going down with the coach and the coaching staff and how they were going to be doing players, in terms of the portal. And one of the things that was talked about, and I was the one that said it at the time, was, well, we could see some movement relatively quickly. Zach Osterman had also mentioned that as a potential possibility. And the reason for that is the settlement that is coming down the pike, the House settlement, which is supposed to restructure the whole concept of NIL and the portal and everything else. And so the idea was, well, you might see a lot of players signing deals early because they want to get the deal signed prior to the new rules going into effect, which are supposed to subject NIL earnings to fair market value analysis. And actually, we've seen like Darren Heitner, who is a pretty prominent NIL attorney, who represents a lot of athletes, saying that a lot of schools are trying to get their clients to sign on the dotted line before the settlement goes into effect, which is supposed to be on Monday night or Monday day of this upcoming week. It's not as dominant of a trend as I thought it was going to be. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because there's simply an atmosphere amongst players and agents and even schools at this point that particular part of the settlement is not really going to be enforceable. The idea that there's going to be, Deloitte or some independent entity coming in and saying, well, sorry, you actually don't deserve that $1 million contract that you got from the local BMW dealership. You're only worth $40,000. The idea that that's actually going to happen, I think, has become more and more fanciful in the eyes of a lot of people in the industry. And so honestly, I think they're right. And we've been talking about this for a while, this idea that how do you establish fair market value? This was something Bill Self, of all people, talked about in a press conference last week. I don't know other industries that utilize that as a way to essentially impose a salary cap, which is essentially what the NCAA or the lawyers in the House settlement are trying to do. It's what the NCAA is kind of hoping is going to happen, at least some of the schools. So I don't think there's the rush that we anticipated there might be in terms of players signing with teams. And, keep in mind the season's not even over yet. We've still got 3 games remaining as of the recording of this show. So there's plenty of time. And, some of the players that IU fans got excited about, they've signed elsewhere. And I think in most cases, what we've seen in terms of those signings has made sense. The recent one, of course, was Josh Dix, who was at Iowa. A lot of people thought Indiana was a player. They had him in. He toured, ends up signing with Creighton, and people kind of freaked out about it. But, he's got an illness in the family that he needs to be closer to home for. And, honestly, when he hit the portal, the first thing I heard about him was Creighton was where he was going to go. So the fact that Indiana was even that deep in the mix for him, I think you can look at as a good sign, not as a problem. Ryan Conwell, who was the guard that Sean Miller used at Xavier, a lot of people had gotten excited, thought that he would be a great addition, ends up signing with Louisville. Louisville's really gone all in on guards. They've really thrown a lot of money around. And, it's one of those where it made sense from a connection perspective that he would go there. And again, I don't see it as any kind of a huge issue that Indiana didn't get him signed because, frankly, there's plenty of good players still out there. And you look at some of the numbers that we've seen rumored with these players. I mean, Conwell getting $2 million a year or $2 million plus, somewhere in that range. There's been some other names that we've seen. I think Xavier Booker, the rumor is that he's going to UCLA and getting a couple $1 million. This goes back to something that I talked about, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, which is this idea that, Indiana's going to have a lot of financial resources, but it doesn't mean you just throw money around for no reason. When you do that, you end up engaging in the kind of dumb free agency signings that we often see unsuccessful NFL teams engage in, or NBA teams maybe would be a better connection. Just because somebody's got a high market value, sometimes that's worth it, but you have to really look at what you're getting for that. And you got to make sure that you're not just throwing money at somebody because you have to have that player in your mind, when there are numerous players out there that can probably fill the same holes for less money and be just as effective. There was a great piece that I would recommend everybody go read. I'm going to put it in the show notes on Substack so you can go check it out. But our old pal, William McDermott, who has had some really good pieces over the course of this past year regarding Indiana basketball and basketball in general on his blog, on his Substack, he points out a couple of things in this piece. And, the piece is called "No Need to Panic Over Indiana's Early Transfer Portal Struggles." And, I think he hits the nail on the head with a couple of these items, one of which is this idea of, that ultimately fit is really important. And I want to read a passage here, just to, kind of give what I think a good illustration of how getting hung up on rankings, getting hung up on who people think is the best signing just in the abstract may not necessarily fit with what you're trying to do. So this is from Will's piece. The transfer portal rankings sub-publications put out are not good barometers of talent, player fit, and system fit. AJ Storr was the fourth best player in the transfer portal last season, according to the rankings. How did that work out? Not good. He basically plummeted his standing in the NBA draft and is now searching for his 100th school, shooting 38.4% from the field and averaging 6 points a game with Kansas. Heck, IU's Kanan Carlisle was rated higher than Arkansas's DJ Wagner, Illinois' Kylan Boswell, Maryland's Jacoby Gillespie, and Kentucky's Lamont Butler. So this is one of the big issues that we see here. And leading into the next paragraph, which I think sums up some of what I'm talking about very well, fit is still important in college basketball. Somewhere down the line, talent acquisition has become surface level, statistic, and rating based. It likely has to do with the money behind these guys. If a school is paying a kid $1 million, the fan base, and in a sense, rightfully so, expects that player to perform to a certain standard. To echo a previous post, if you wanted Darren DeVries to throw stuff at a wall, seeing what sticks in an attempt to acquire as much talent as possible, as fast as possible, you won't be getting that. And, he points out like Connor Enright signing doesn't make a lot of sense on paper because Enright's stats weren't that great last year. But Enright is a guy who's played in DeVries' system. He had an injury last year that kept him from really playing to his full capacity. But he had the 15th best assist rate in the nation and already plays really good defense. So there's a lot of factors at play with all of this. And one of the things I think that IU fans have got to get over in their head is this idea that you go out and just acquire the best talent and that will automatically work regardless of what the system looks like. And we saw this with Archie Miller. We saw this certainly with Mike Woodson, that even getting a top-level player is no guarantee that you're going to be successful if the system that you're plugging them into isn't something that yields the sort of results that are going to put you in the top 15, top 20 of the nation, which is where Indiana wants to be. I mean, Indiana did really well in the portal last year. They signed a bunch of really good players. And it didn't work because they got plugged into a system that didn't work. And the overall atmosphere on the roster last year was a struggle for a lot of those guys. And so I just would say pump the brakes on thinking that things are not going well. And it's tough. I get it. You look around, you see Texas is signing players. They just signed Cam Heide from Purdue, that's an interesting one. Louisville has signed a bunch of really good players. Michigan just signed a guy that is probably going to the draft anyway, but what the guy that was rated the top player in the portal is going to Michigan. So you could look at that as an IU fan and be like, oh my goodness, what's going on? Indiana doesn't even have their assistants completely announced yet. We've heard about Drew Adams. We've heard about Nick Norton. You're going to see a couple more assistants announced here pretty soon. And I think at that point, you'll start to see things cooking. Why is that taking so long? Well, again, Indiana's assembling what I think is going to be a really good staff, and they're coming from different places. And I think in some cases, their seasons either just ended or maybe even haven't ended yet. And so there's negotiations involved in all of that. There's trying to figure out how the business is going to work. Those assistants are going to have players that will come with them in the process. Maybe not from that school, but players that they have connections with. So my advice would be just let this play out. There's been a lot of, I think, well-intentioned and accurate messaging from certain accounts out there on social media that have highlighted how long it took Darren DeVries to assemble his roster last year at West Virginia. That ended up being a pretty good roster overall. How long it took Dusty May to assemble his roster last year. You're starting from a standing start here as Darren DeVries. You're not hitting the ground running, and you're basically having to do a complete culture flip of the program while also simultaneously bringing in players that match your vision for what the program's going to be. As much as IU fans have lamented the lack of success that this program has had over the last 25 years, if you're serious about this idea that Indiana needs to get back to a point where they are a perennial contender, you've got to build that foundation carefully. You've got to build that foundation in a way that's sustainable. And you got to put the right pieces in early, because that's what establishes the culture. I was curious before this whole thing got started, how much of what Darren DeVries had done in the 1 year at West Virginia in terms of player acquisition was he going to bring in? Was he going to bring in the recruits? Was he going to bring in anybody other than his son? Doesn't look like that's going to be the case. He looks like he's just kind of starting with his son and then building fresh, which makes sense given that this is a different resource allocation setup than you have at West Virginia. A lot more money available, a lot higher standards. And again, I would look at it and say, until we have definitive evidence to the contrary, I'm going to trust what Darren DeVries' vision is on this. And when you think about, culture is so important. Culture is why Indiana football ended up in the college football playoff this year and won the most games in the school's history. Now, that was a little bit of a different setup because Curt Cignetti had a pre-existing culture that he was able to bring in coaches and a good number of players, and they were able to infuse that culture over the course of the spring and summer into the existing roster and the new guys that they brought in from elsewhere. It's a little different in basketball, in as much as the culture can be, I think, established without necessarily having to bring a huge number of people in, because you can go out and find the right people that match your vision a lot easier. And you can get contributions essentially from the whole spectrum, like incoming freshmen all the way to graduate student transfers. So all of that to say, I think if we're still here at the beginning of May and Indiana has signed no players and doesn't have any assistant coaches other than the two that have been mentioned so far, go ahead, panic at that point. I'll be right there panicking with you. As of right now, don't panic. This is how things are supposed to go. And when you see names going elsewhere that have been mentioned in conjunction with Indiana, don't freak out. Don't believe that Indiana's just missing out on guys left and right or is getting turned down. For all we know, Indiana's turning those people down after speaking with them. And it might be not a good culture fit. It might be maybe not as, maybe the talent isn't actually what people are looking at, or maybe it doesn't fit into the system. Maybe the player doesn't want to play defense or doesn't think that that's a valued thing. Or maybe it's just a situation where they're a good player, but what they're asking for from a money perspective doesn't make a lot of sense in the marketplace. That's a factor you have to think about. So just pump the brakes a little bit on the panic if you're panicked. And for those of you who aren't or haven't been paying that close attention, just let the process play out. This was a hire that was made deliberately. There's a runway with all of this, and there's plenty of time. And again, let's see how things go over the course of the next couple of weeks. Let's see what the staff announcement looks like, and let's see what shakes out from there. So just stick with us, I guess, on all of this as we move forward. Some random items from around the college basketball world that I thought were interesting and worth talking about that are related to Indiana, in as much as Indiana's playing in the same space that all of these other programs are playing in now. But I've been thinking a lot about the hire of DeVries, and it's interesting because as we've started to look at the overall sentiments from people, there's a wait and see from a lot of fans. And I don't blame them, because who is Darren DeVries? Unless you're a basketball junkie or someone that really follows the game closely, you probably aren't familiar with his work. We've talked about his work quite a bit on this show. We've seen him profiled in various things. He's started to do more and more interviews, so I think people are getting a little bit of a better sense of his personality and what he values. It's interesting in terms of coaching hires and fit and everything. So much of what we are looking at in this sport at this point, especially college basketball, there's a disassociation, I think, in terms of some fan bases really even understanding why they're successful or why their program isn't successful. And I think Indiana kind of falls into that category as well, in as much as so much about college basketball is about fit. It's about, is this moment right for this coach? Is this environment something that this coach can thrive in? And are they able to rise to that challenge? And to some degree, as we've detailed over the course of the past 25 years, a lot of the problems Indiana has had have been wrong fit. Ryan and Scott, I thought, did a good job of diving into that with Kelvin Sampson and his hiring. Great coach. And Scott mentioned, like, well, if Sampson, if there's that scenario where Sampson doesn't get fired and he's still here, and you're talking about, a bunch of titles or Final Fours or, Big Ten championships. And that might be true. I think the one thing I'd add to that, though, is I don't know that Kelvin Sampson was ever going to be a good cultural fit for Indiana, in as much as Kelvin Sampson, as we saw from the way that the issues that players had off the court in his 2 years here, it was clear that the things that he valued at that point were different from the things that Indiana valued. And that's not a commentary on who was right or wrong. It is a commentary on the idea that that was the wrong fit. And, whether or not it's a great basketball coach or not a great basketball coach, fit matters. There was an interesting article that Matt Norlander wrote about John Shire, the head coach of Duke, whose team is probably going to win the national championship. Got the best player in the country. They've been the best team over the course of the season. And it was interesting because, if you remember, and the article brings this up, Shire wanted the DePaul job a couple of years ago, really wanted it. He's from Chicago. DePaul, most people don't think about DePaul unless you're like my age or older. And I'm barely old enough to remember DePaul being regularly good. DePaul used to be a really good basketball team. Never won a title, but had a legendary coach in Ray Meyer. Went to, I think, a couple of Final Fours over the course of his tenure. They were a player in the Chicago basketball marketplace. They got a lot of good talent that came through there. And then they fell off a cliff about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And this was the first year that they had even kind of anything resembling a pulse in Chris Holtman's first season. They still didn't make the tournament, obviously, but they looked like an actual basketball program. They turned down John Shire. They did not hire John Shire. And we also found out that John Shire really wanted the UNLV job. Didn't get that either. DePaul and UNLV, two programs that have had success, but certainly are not at the top of the basketball mountain right now, turned down the guy that's got the number one team in the country. Would he have been that good of a coach at those places? Probably not. It's a real hard ski to get talent to DePaul, to get UNLV winning at a top level. But you can't look at John Shire at Duke and say, well, he's just winning because of Duke, because as we've seen at other programs, including the one 8 miles down the road in Chapel Hill, it's easy to hire the wrong coach and put yourself in a position where suddenly you are going the wrong direction. I mean, North Carolina, they rallied, they got to the NCAA tournament. I would feel real shaky if I was a North Carolina fan right now about the future prospects under that particular coaching staff, just as we saw with Matt Doherty there 20-some years ago. Fit is important, and that's where you don't ever totally know. I'm sure that when you look at some of the failed hires that have happened, not just at Indiana, but at elsewhere, people talk themselves into this is going to work or that's going to work. This coach is going to be a great fit. And most of the time it doesn't work out. And the cases where it does, those are the programs that have thrived. I mean, we've talked about this with Michigan State. Would Tom Izzo have been a great coach somewhere else? Maybe. He's never been other places, at least, not for the bulk of his career. He was an assistant coach in East Lansing for years before becoming the head coach right off the bench as an assistant, replacing Judd Heathcote. And, as I think we went through a couple months ago on the podcast, Michigan State has not always been a great program. They won a national title in 79. They had a couple of regional finals that they went to in the 80s or early 90s, but there were a lot of years where Michigan State had a losing record overall, not just in the conference, but overall. Tom Izzo took that program, and it was a perfect fit. Is it the location, the resources, his abilities, his understanding of how to essentially utilize those resources to their best effect allowed Michigan State to become one of the dominant programs of the last 25 years. And so I always think about that when I think about DeVries and the hire here at IU and the trepidation that some fans feel because it's not a big name. The big question is going to be, is it the right fit? And again, we won't know for a while, but I do think you have to take it on faith, given what Indiana did on the football side and going out and finding the right cultural fit, a guy that not only came to Indiana, saw the potential, saw that things needed to get changed in terms of the culture and the atmosphere and the identity. And then essentially, it wasn't just that he did all of those things. It was that he suddenly realized or felt like this could be me. This could be my program. I could build my reputation into this program, and the two things could thrive simultaneously. I mean, a lot of people forget already, but, in October, a lot of concern, a lot of rumors that, Cignetti was going to get hired somewhere else, that a bigger program, a program with more history was going to be like, we're going to go get that guy. Look what he did in Indiana in 1 year. We'll just bring him in and do it at a higher level. And you heard about West Virginia, or you heard about, like Auburn, I think, or not Auburn. I forget which. There was another program, maybe it was Florida State, when there was some talk, given how bad their program was going at that point. And whatever the individual schools were, it's 8:30 on a Saturday morning. I'm forgetting the specifics, but the reality was one of the greatest parts of that hire was that they hired a guy who not only was able to make that kind of a cultural change with IU football, but also was the kind of guy who could see himself continuing that level of excellence at IU, not just jumping to the next environment. Now, it's ironic that we talk about that in light of Darren DeVries, who gets hired at West Virginia and then immediately jumps to Indiana. But again, Indiana's kind of in the opposite case there, in that Indiana is, even though they haven't had the success from a financial perspective, from a reputational perspective, they are one of the top dogs, one of the programs that, if they were that equivalent in football, you would have been worried about trying to lure Cignetti away. So I do think that you're looking at a different type of hire in basketball and how that ends up relating to what Indiana is able to do. But, I feel like DeVries, from a cultural perspective, from a style of play perspective, is the right type of cultural fit, at least the right archetype of a cultural fit. And we won't know until we actually see things in action, not just in the portal, but on the floor. So it is going to have to be kind of a wait and see approach with everything. But as we see across the country, if you don't have the right fit, you're going to end up going back to the well a lot. And it kind of reminds me of this whole Kevin Willard situation at Maryland and now at Villanova, where, what the heck went on there? Was it all Kevin Willard's fault? No, probably not. I do think there were probably, given what we've known historically about the Maryland athletic department, there were probably some legitimate financial concerns. But it was also clear that Kevin Willard was not going to be a guy that cared that much about the culture he was establishing at Maryland. And it makes me wonder why Villanova's decided that this is the guy that they want to spend money on to hire. I'm always fascinated by this. Villanova is one of those programs where it almost felt like they kind of stumbled into Jay Wright after, Villanova won a national title in the 80s and then was not really a major player for about 10, 15 years. And then they get Wright, and Wright slowly builds them into a program that wins 2 national titles. Then they hire Kyle Neptune thinking, we'll just continue this. And it clearly was the wrong fit. Now they go hire Kevin Willard. Why? Like, Kevin Willard was in the Big East already at a less resourced school, granted, at Seton Hall. But it smacks of a weird kind of desperation where it's like, oh, that guy has a good team this year. That guy knows how to win in the Big East. Let's go hire him. And then you look at Kevin Willard's like history from a results perspective, and it's pretty meh. And then you look at what he just did at Maryland, and it's like, that's the culture you're bringing in. That's a big risk. Maybe it works. Maybe Kevin Willard really needs to be at a private Catholic institution, and maybe he needs to have all of the attention being on basketball, which it is at Villanova, and it's not at Maryland. So maybe it is a good fit, and maybe just Kevin Willard was a bad fit at Maryland. I do think it's telling that Maryland then turns around and hires a guy in Buzz Williams who is notorious. Not just notorious like from a reputational perspective. Like there's been stories written about Buzz Williams. There's been podcasts done about Buzz Williams where he talks about, when you hit your 7th year as a head coach and people start to turn on you and they don't judge you on the initial expectations. They're judging you on the expectations of what you've done, to which I'm like, yes, of course, that's how it's supposed to work. And so he leaves, and it's why he's jumped from Marquette to Virginia Tech to Texas A&M, now to Maryland. And whatever you want to say about Buzz Williams in terms of, his teams play hard. They've had some success at the NCAA level, certainly not high-level success. But Maryland's like, I guess, I don't know if they felt desperate or if they really felt like this was the right type of hire, but it really feels like Maryland just essentially got a rental for 4 or 5 years. And maybe that's what they need at this point. Maybe, without an athletic director, maybe that's the best they can do. But that's the kind of hire that you worry that your program's going to make. A hire where it's a convenience thing as opposed to this is a person we really think can grow our culture. And, Maryland obviously won a national title, unfortunately, against Indiana. And Gary Williams really established a great culture there. And, that was coming off of the culture that Lefty Driesell had established. They've had trouble with that since then. And it's, again, a question of, is it the coach issue or is it the program itself? And that's the big question about Indiana to kind of wrap up this particular segment. Are the cultural issues or the lack of fit issues that Indiana's had in basketball, where do those come from? Is it the coach? I tend to think at Indiana, it's generally the coach because Indiana has historically given a ton of latitude to their coaches, their head coaches, in terms of how they run the program. But we're going to see in this next couple of years, if Darren DeVries isn't able to get things going here, if that suddenly starts to look like a bad fit, then you got to start to wonder, well, what is actually the problem? So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And I think that's the big question that's in the back of most people's minds, even if they're not necessarily thinking about it. I think it's something worth thinking about. It's nothing to freak out about. It's more, I'm just curious. It's like I'm going in and sitting down in a theater and about to watch a movie that I know nothing about. I know who the actors are, and I have a general idea of what the plot is from the title. But I don't know how it's going to play out. And you just hope that by the time we get to the end of the movie, we can, when the lights come on, we're like, okay, yeah, that was great. That actually exceeded my expectations. That would be a nice change of pace from how these things have gone with IU over the last quarter century. Last thing I wanted to hit is something that was getting tossed around on X yesterday regarding the whole concept of the amount of money that's being spent on some of the players out there. And there was an interesting tweet by Will Warren, who has the Stats by Will Substack, which is a really good, if you're a basketball nerd, it's a Substack I'd highly recommend. But he retweeted a tweet. I'm actually going to put it up on the screen here for those of you that are watching. He retweeted something from Front Office Sports. They were quoting the Grambling State coach. Let me zoom in here a little bit. I think you can see it just fine. Grambling State head coach Mickey Joseph says there should be buyouts when players transfer up to bigger programs. Quote, there needs to be a buyout. If they move up from me and go G5 or P4, I should get compensation for that. And Will Warren's quote tweet on that was, college basketball fans / coaches / players suddenly discovering the 100-plus-year-old and largely successful soccer transfer model is a good bit. I had the same thought. And it's something we've alluded to a little bit on this show before. the transfer market, not the transfer portal. This kind of reminds me of, what was it, last week when we were talking about the difference between the net in the selection process and net efficiency margin in KenPom. Similar names, but different concepts. This is a similar kind of thing. But I think it's an informative one, and it's one, if you follow European soccer, you're familiar with the transfer market, at least I would hope so. If you don't, you may not be. And this is actually something that I teach in one of the classes that I teach. A lot of the uncertainty or the lack of knowledge of how other systems work across the world is just kind of a product of how all-consuming American sports are and how unique they are in terms of their setup. And I think for a lot of fans, you're kind of locked into this thought process that everything is like the NBA or the NFL in terms of how things work. And think about how those leagues operate. They have an entry draft. They have a salary cap. They have, the NBA's case, they have guaranteed contracts. And all of those things that I just mentioned, they don't really exist in the same form in the rest of the world, at least not in the most popular sports in the rest of the world. And I think when you think about the college landscape, whether it's football or basketball or any of the other sports, we really should stop looking to American professional sports as the model through which we understand and model or try to pattern player movement, because it just doesn't work. One of the reasons why the NBA or the NFL does what they do and why they're able to do what they do is that these are closed systems utilizing franchises. These are not just independent entities. These are essentially facets of a larger diamond. These are part of a whole. If I wanted, as I was talking about this in class, if I wanted to start an NFL team, I couldn't just go get a bunch of billionaires together and launch a team. I have to petition the NBA or the NFL or the NBA for an expansion franchise. I can't just start one myself and move it in. And so that means essentially you have to be let into the club. Same thing with being a player. You have to go through the entry draft in order to be a player, unless there's a specific set of circumstances. And it's very rare that those circumstances would kick in. So if it's why, for instance, like when Maurice Claret sued the NFL because he wanted to go to the NFL early, the court sided with the NFL. They said, well, no, you can't do that. The NFL has rules about who can enter the NFL. You have to be in college for 3 years or not college. You have to be out of high school for 3 years. And you have to go through the draft process. You can't just sign with anybody. That's how they maintain a sense of order in terms of who comes in. College doesn't work that way. And when you look at colleges, you have the Big Ten, you have the conference, 18 teams, you have 16 teams in the SEC. You've got, the different conferences that are out there at the power level, at the group of 5 level. You've got the conferences below that. These are essentially partnerships for scheduling and media deals and whatnot, and refereeing and so forth. But they're not closed systems the same way that the NBA or the NFL or the NHL or Major League Baseball are. One of the things about all of those sports that I just mentioned at the professional level is that, they have collective bargaining, which you've heard me talk about before on the show. Collective bargaining meaning there's a players' union, players join that union, and they essentially opt into the contractual rules that you have to have between that labor union, the NFLPA, the MLBPA, whatever, and the league. The league is the franchises. And that's where the rules are set in terms of how much money you can make in contracts and who gets drafted, like who's eligible to be drafted, and how contracts are utilized. In the NBA, which I'll stick with for the example that I'm trying to talk through here, in the NBA, once you sign a contract, the contract is the business element. So if you have a trade, like the Luka Doncic trade, you're trading essentially Luka Doncic's contract from one team to another. Whenever you see, a team trading a player to get their salary cap, like an expiring contract, off the books. You're trading the contract. You're not necessarily, yes, you are trading the player, but the contract is what matters. That is not how it works elsewhere, but that's how it works in the NBA. At least that's not how it works in other countries, but it works in the NBA because, again, the NBA is a closed system. And once you're in that system, the only thing you have to worry about is the contractual relationship between the teams and the players that are in the NBA. The reason why that doesn't work at the college level is these teams are not in a closed system. I mean, you look at the number of teams that will go up or down in leagues or go up and down in divisions. You know, we've added 100 teams, 100 plus teams to Division I over the course of the last 35, 40 years. The Big Ten just added a bunch of teams. You know, there's movement all over the place, and there's a ton of teams. And it's very similar to what you see in soccer in other countries. In England, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, that's how those systems work. There's a certain number of clubs that are all over the place in different levels, and you've got players moving around in all of those, but there's no collective bargaining because there's no entities to collectively bargain. You're talking about a much broader system of international players from different countries going and playing internationally or domestically for the clubs either in their own country or elsewhere. So the way that this ends up working is there's no draft because there's no league to draft into. There's no, if you follow the Premier League, for instance, there's no Premier League draft. That's not how it works. You sign players or you develop players yourself. And then at some point you may want to sell one of those players, either because they're not doing what you were hoping that they would do, or they've outlived their usefulness, or maybe they are moving up to an even bigger club. That system is probably the system that needs to be in place here in college sports, because I just don't see a future where all of the colleges band together and say, we are part of the same entity, and we are going to recognize that A, the athletes are professionals, this is their job, and B, that they form a union and that we recognize the union and collectively bargain with it. Like, that seems to be the red line that these colleges and universities just refuse to do. They might try to do the first part. They might try to form a super league. We've heard about this idea that you could see, you know, the top four power conferences break away from the NCAA. But that's only half the equation. The other half of the equation is, are you ever going to recognize the athletes as employees, and are you going to allow them to unionize so that you can have collective bargaining back and forth? And that seems really unlikely. I mean, honestly, even the Super League idea seems unlikely because, as we've talked about on this show a bunch over the course of time, these universities don't really want to partner with each other. They are constantly in competition on everything, not just athletics. They're in competition over enrollment. They're in competition over grants. They're in competition over partnerships with industry. They're not really wired like franchises are wired in professional sports or even professional sports entities in other countries, because this is only one part of a much larger business model for most colleges and universities. And their responsibilities are ultimately to their alumni and their constituents, not to some broader athletics collective. So what you're probably looking at, I think, if this is ultimately going to work, is a system that kind of works like the transfer market. And this is where a lot of Americans who don't follow soccer are like, what the hell are you talking about? And so this is my attempt to explain it a little bit. So basically, if you understand how all this works, feel free to leave a comment about how you think it should work moving forward. But if you don't understand how it works, where these things happen in you know, so let's just take the Premier League as an example. You'll have players that will start off at youth academies. And again, it's a different kind of system. It's a system that the U.S. is kind of moving towards. But historically, U.S. athletic development has been tied to the scholastic model, as I call it, the model where you have to go to school to play sports. And if you think about it, that's still how it is to a large degree. Yes, we have AAU, we have travel teams, we have teams that aren't tied to schools necessarily. But since college basketball and college football are essentially the de facto transition points through which you become eligible to play in the NBA and the NFL, respectively. You have a system where you still have to go through high school. You have to get good enough grades to get into a college in order to play football or basketball at that level, to put you in a position where you can then get drafted and go play in the professional league. Now, we've seen players occasionally try to go around that system. They'll go overseas for a year, but that's very rare. And the vast majority of athletes in the U.S. still do that. It's not really how it works in other countries. You're going to an academy and you're developing your skills there. And yes, you're getting some schooling, but you're there to develop as an athlete. And there's always been a real negative attitude towards that by a lot of Americans, because they've been told over and over again that, the athletics is secondary, the education is the primary thing that we need to focus on. And that, again, that's not really how it works in the rest of the world. So what happens with players is they'll develop. Sometimes they develop at a club, and, you're talking about development that can be anywhere from, 5 to 15 years in some cases. 15 might be a little bit extreme. 5 to 10 years, let's say. When you turn 18, you turn professional. And if you are a player that is of use to your club at that point because you're that talented, you might start playing professional games. You could even play a little bit earlier. I mean, it's not unheard of in the Premier League to see a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old make an appearance. It's rare, but it's not unheard of. But most of the time, as a younger player, you're not ready to play against the best of the best in the Premier League or in Serie A or in the Bundesliga. So they'll go through this process called loans, where, let's take an example. I'm going to use Harry Kane and kind of show you what his pathway looked like. If you don't know who Harry Kane was, Harry Kane played for Tottenham for many years. He now plays for Bayern Munich. And let me zoom in a little bit, and just because I want to walk you through what Harry Kane's pathway looked like. So if you have to go all the way back, Harry Kane is he was born in 1993, July 28, 1993. So essentially, when he was 17 years old, he leaves Rovers FC youth and he goes to the Arsenal youth setup. And then a year later, he goes back from Arsenal youth to Rovers FC, then goes from Rovers FC to Watford, then from Watford to Tottenham. So at that age, he's still very young, and he's with Tottenham, but he's not doing a ton there. He's on the under-18 team for Spurs, and he does that for 4 or 5 years. By the time he gets to, he was 12 when he was with Rovers FC youth. I miscalculated the time. So by the time he turns 18, he's no longer eligible for the under-18 team, which is basically like the developmental squad. Now, he's not good enough to play for Tottenham at that point. So what do they do? Does he leave? Sort of. He goes to Leyton Orient on a loan. What that means is he's still owned by Tottenham. Like, his rights are still owned by Tottenham. But now he's playing for this team called Leyton Orient, who's a team, I think at the time they were in League One, which is the third tier of English soccer. Plays with them for half a season, January to May, and then he goes back to Tottenham. The following year, he's loaned from Tottenham to Millwall, who I think at that time was in the Championship, which is the second level. So what he's doing is they're basically sending him somewhere where he can play against competition that is better than the under-18 team or the under-23 team that might be at Tottenham. It's live games. The games actually matter. It's at a lower level than the Premier League, but that's the way that he develops his skills. And that's the way that he becomes the player that he eventually becomes. So he goes through that loan. Then in 2012, he gets loaned to Norwich. I don't remember if Norwich was in the Premier League or in the Championship at that point, but he's good enough for Norwich that they end up having to pay a 500,000 euro fee for his services. And what that means is that Tottenham's making 500,000 euro off of the fact that they are loaning Harry Kane to this team. And the reason that that works is he's got value on the marketplace. And this is where the transfer portal stuff in college starts to enter in. He's got value in the marketplace. He's a good player at that point, and it's worth it to Norwich to pay that amount of money to get him on loan. They're not paying for him permanently, but they get him for that season. And so he comes in, he plays, knowing that he's going to go back to Tottenham and probably start playing there. Now, he ends up doing one more of those loans to Leicester. plays a year for Leicester, or plays half a year for Leicester, and then comes back, another $500,000 loan amount. Then he's at Tottenham. And of course, if you follow soccer, you know Harry Kane blossoms during that decade he's at Tottenham into, one of the best goal scorers in English Premier League history. And after 10 years, he wants to move on. And so Tottenham now suddenly is like, well, what can we get for Harry Kane on the open market? And they end up getting $95 million, or 95 million euro, is more in dollars, from Bayern Munich. And Harry Kane goes to Bayern Munich. Now, the way that this works from a systematic perspective, I think there's a lot of informative items just in that array of what we talked about how this could work in college sports. So you got this whole idea of loans, and there's actually even another layer to that where there are certain business relationships between soccer teams where they're called feeder clubs, where you'll have a top team and then you'll have teams that it's affiliated with at lower levels. Not too different from how Major League Baseball has affiliations with the minor leagues, and it works in a very similar pattern. In fact, baseball in general, MLB, the player development system is a lot closer to English soccer or soccer globally than it is to the player development systems that you see in the NBA and the NFL, because minor league baseball or professional baseball in general doesn't predate the college athletic system, but for that sport, it developed separately. That's why college baseball it's grown in importance, but it's still not that important in terms of overall talent development or talent acquisition. It's grown in importance because of Moneyball, but for a long time, the best pure talent was generally not going and playing college baseball. So anyway, you've got that system where you can affiliate with different clubs and you can send players down regularly, and that's how the reciprocity works. If I'm a Premier League team and I've got a feeder club that's in the championship and another one that's in League One, and I've got these players who are good and they could be great, and I want to develop them, but I can't play them on my team because I've got to play against the best teams in the world who have the best players in the world right now. There's not a lot of room for an 18, 19-year-old that's a B- playing against a bunch of A's and A+. Well, how do you get that person to that level? Well, you send them down. They go play at a level where they are playing amongst other B's and B- and C+. And they get better, or they don't. And sometimes you'll have situations where you'll send a player down and they won't pan out. They can't, they end up not being able to play at those progressively higher levels of competition. So it's a good system in a way because it supplies lower level teams with players that they wouldn't be able to afford, allows those players to develop, and allows the top teams to have a large roster of players that they have essentially in reserve. And if they develop properly, they can bring them up and they can have them play in the first team, or they can sell them if they've got a surplus of players at a certain position. But that improves the player's market value to be able to point to what they did at the second level or third level and say, well, gosh, this guy scored 14 goals, or this guy was a really good defender at this level, and here's the film. That's how the market starts to generate value. And that's essentially what the Grambling coach was talking about there, but in a slightly different way. What he's talking about is, and we've seen this with a bunch of different players. We see it with Janai Broom, who started at Morehead State. Right now, because he's not an employee, Janai Broom owed nothing to Morehead State, and Morehead State owed nothing to Janai Broom after that first year. All of these scholarships that we give players at the college level are 1 year renewable. They're not 4-year or 5-year scholarships. And so Broom goes to Morehead State. He was clearly under-recruited, ends up at an Ohio Valley school, is there for a year, or maybe 2, and Bruce Pearl, looking around and evaluating talent, sees something in this guy and is like, that's a guy that I think can be great. Auburn's able to go in, get him to transfer to Auburn, probably offered him a good financial package to do so, and he moves up. And boom, there you go. Suddenly you've got less, like a player that Auburn wouldn't have recruited. They identify, hey, this guy's playing well at a lower level. Let's go ahead and bring him up to the next level. Except the problem is Morehead State gets nothing out of that. And it ends up being kind of a free development process And you see it at the college football level too, where you've got players that will get good at one level and then they will transfer to a much higher level. We talked about that on a previous show. A lot of people are like, well, where's your loyalty there? Don't you owe something to that smaller school? And the answer is why? This is the idea of, well, I signed with this smaller school, so I must stay there. Sounds great in theory, but realistically, it's not how player development works anywhere else in the world. The idea is you want to play against better and better competition, not I signed with this small club in soccer and I must stay there for the entirety of the contract. So understanding that this system works elsewhere and has worked for a long time, like the transfer market didn't just pop up overnight. This is something that's been around for a long time. I think there's a lot that you can take out of that when it comes to what we might be doing in college sports or what we should be doing, but it would be a radically different system. Because, as I alluded to earlier, why we don't already have a system starting to get in place where Indiana University, for instance, enters into a partnership with an FCS school for football. And so Indiana goes out and signs 120 players, hypothetically. But they have a feeder club that they can utilize and send some of those players down and have them develop. Like, let's say it's Indiana State. Indiana partners with Indiana State. And Indiana says, Indiana State, we're going to send you 35 scholarship, in quotes, players a year. You have to play them. You have to put them out on the field, even if they're not totally ready, because we want to see them develop, because ultimately we want to be able to bring those players up to our level in a year or two. They'll play hard for you, but the idea is we need that developmental piece. That right now that's happening without any official reciprocal agreements. So it's not really helping the smaller schools. And this is where, for a lot of smaller schools, I think they're looking around and they're saying, well, do we really want to be a part of this in the first place? Because we don't want to just be an uncompensated feeder system for the top levels of college sports, which is kind of what they're becoming. And you even see it at the mid-level. I mean, for all the talk this year about how the NCAA tournament didn't have a lot of upsets, we talked about the transfer portal really having an impact on those smaller teams. It does. But without some kind of contractual agreement, either with the player, where it's like, well, we're signing you for 2 years or 3 years, or any sort of contractual agreement between the schools, it's going to be this unfettered movement of players from place to place. And players are going to and should try to move to better schools where they're playing against better competition, because the best players are going to utilize that to be able to improve their professional prospects. And it's funny because it's like, you think about the IHSAA and historically how, they wouldn't let you move for athletics reasons, and they would bar you from playing if you moved from one school district to another for athletics reasons. And it just illustrates like how kind of screwed up our priorities have been historically with athletics in the United States. Like it's been so program driven. It's been so like high school athletic program driven or college athletic program driven that we've lost sight of the fact that for a lot of players, the best development isn't going to come at the place where they just happen to be geographically or where they happen to sign because they didn't have a whole lot of other offers as a high school senior. And that's not a badge of honor. Like, that's not something that we should be celebrating. We should be looking at that and saying, well, we're actually kind of depriving these players of the opportunity to achieve their maximum potential if they have the talent. So when I look at the transfer market, it's not perfect, but it certainly has a lot of benefits in terms of being more aligned with how player development normally works. And it also aligns a lot more with kind of the natural ebb and flow of how clubs like to sign players and how that fits into the larger tapestry of what they're trying to do with their teams from a year-to-year basis. One of the other things that's interesting about the transfer market, and it goes back to what the Grambling coach talked about, is this idea of, I should get compensated if my player goes to the G5 or P4 level. And it kind of hits on, again, a contractual thing that really can only be addressed if the schools that comprise the NCAA finally admit what everybody knows, which is that the people playing the revenue sports are employees. They're we've been over this ground many times. in the transfer market, it's interesting. So I mentioned like the Harry Kane deal from Tottenham to Bayern Munich. His market value in that transfer window was estimated at about 90 million euro. Tottenham ends up getting 95 million euro from Bayern Munich, so a little higher than what you would expect, given the estimated market value. That's still a lot of money. It's the way that works. However, from an executional perspective, is different than how a trade would work in the NBA. So when Luka Doncic gets traded to the Lakers, his contract trades with him. The amount of money doesn't change that he's being paid, at least in that particular circumstance. Obviously, you've had situations where, players will move because they're planning on signing an extension elsewhere. But a lot of times you'll see like sign-in trades. And the reason that sign-in trades exist in the NBA is that it's the contract that matters, and the contract is transferable between the teams because the teams are all in business with each other. That's not how it works in soccer. It's also not how it works in college because they're not really in business with each other, not in terms of player movement. So in soccer, Tottenham decides to sign or to sell Harry Kane to Bayern Munich. So Bayern Munich essentially writes a check. I'm simplifying this, but they essentially write a check for 95 million euro to Tottenham. That does not mean that the deal's over. At that point, then Harry Kane enters into negotiations with Bayern Munich for a new contract because once he is sold from Tottenham to Bayern Munich, his contract with Tottenham's done. He has to agree essentially to the move, and part of the agreement of the move is that the contract he has with Tottenham no longer exists. And outside of the guaranteed money that he would have been paid perhaps in an upfront, kind of the version of a signing bonus like you see in the NBA or in the NFL, they're off the hook for whatever they owe him on the contract moving forward because the contract is no longer valid. So now he's going to Bayern Munich, and before the transfer can be agreed to, he has to agree to terms with Bayern Munich on a new contract. So Bayern Munich and he have to negotiate with each other about how much he's worth. That's the model that we're talking about that the Grambling coach is mentioning. This idea that, let's say Grambling has 10 players and they've all signed them to 2-year deals. And let's say after 1 year, there's one player that's really awesome and everybody wants him in the country. Right now, there's no multi-year deals with NIL, at least not with the schools, because they're not employees. They're students. Under an employee model, you could sign a guy for 2 years. And if a team came and said, well, we want to buy this player or get this player's services, you could say, all right, well, you have to pay a buyout clause or you have to essentially pay us a transfer fee in order to get this player. And then the player would have to agree to new terms with you, which they probably would. I mean, if it was Texas coming in and trying to sign a Grambling player, I'm sure they would want to go. But again, you're talking about a situation where that kind of a system only works if you are thinking about things through a transfer market model. It doesn't really work in the traditional NBA system because the contracts wouldn't be transferable. Like Grambling's probably not, whatever their NIL setup is, they're probably not locking a player into a lucrative deal that's going to be on par with even like a Louisiana Tech or a Tulane, let alone a Texas or an LSU. So again, you have to think about how does this logically play out from a financial perspective, from a labor perspective. The system we have right now sucks, and I think everybody's aware that it sucks. But it sucks for reasons different than what a lot of people like to think. It sucks not because players are moving from team to team. I mean, that's a bad byproduct, obviously, for fans. But it sucks because the athletic departments just are not admitting what business they're in at this point. And because the universities have been so hell-bent on maintaining that athletes aren't employees, that they're students, as you would have with any other student going from one institution to the next, you don't have any legal basis for saying, sorry, you can't do that. Because once you start arguing that, then you can't really argue that you're a student because students have the ability to go wherever they want. There's a whole piece I read this morning that ProPublica did on University of Illinois athletics and the fact that their athletes aren't reporting their NIL deal values, despite there being a state law in Illinois saying that you have to do that. But it's interesting reading through it because there's a lot of hand-wringing in the article about how this isn't happening and how athletes are having to navigate this system alone as, 18 to 21-year-olds, like they're children. And again, I'll point back to the soccer model that I talked about earlier on, where you've got 18-year-olds that are signing professional contracts and being moved around the chessboard, sometimes by themselves to develop, sometimes by the teams that own their contracts. You've got, this is what's always been frustrating about the discussion around college athletics to me, is that we really infantilize a lot of athletes in this country. We act like as an 18-year-old, you're not capable of making decisions on your own, or that you're making all these decisions by yourself. You generally have family involved. In many cases, we've framed family intervention as somehow being bad, like it's somehow damaging to the player if you've got family that are looking out for the player's best interests. Why is that? It's largely because, tapping into another issue we've discussed, a lot of the news, a lot of the reporting, a lot of the commentary around college sports is driven by what is best for coaches, because coaches are the ones that talk to reporters. Coaches are the ones that frame the concept of college athletics. And in many cases, coaches are viewed as the program in most cases. And whatever is bad for the coach is bad for the program. And for coaches, what's bad is not having control over your players in the system. Players having control over their own movement and their own finances is a threat and has been for decades. But it's important to remember that it's only a threat within the framing of the NCAA. And if you look broadly across the world, the rest of the world for a long time in sports like soccer and basketball professionally have been on a totally different model. And that model has worked just fine. And I think as we try to grasp for understanding, especially in the post-House settlement era, whatever that ends up affecting, I think we need to start thinking about, are there different models, better models that aren't modeled off of the traditional scholastic model, the high school, college, pro chain of things, that might both help players and also give some sanity to fans who are trying to figure out who's on their roster from year to year. I don't think that works unless you stop looking at 18-year-olds as children and start looking at them like emancipated adults, which they are legally. So anyway, a lot to ponder with all of that. But I thought I saw that pop up, thought it would be worth a little bit of an extended segment here on the show. So we'll welcome your comments, whether it's here or whether it's on the Substack or on the Back Home Network Discord. Certainly enjoy chatting with all you folks. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Enjoy the Final Four games. I wish I could say enjoy the weather, but it is an absolute lake out here in the Midwest with all of the rain, and probably going to continue here over the course of the next couple of days. So stay dry, stay safe. Don't drive into standing water. That's my advice for the day. Anyway, for CrimsonCast and the Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavier. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the bison. So long, everybody.